Picture this, your grandmother sitting down to a dinner of pickled pig's feet, washing it down with a glass of celery tonic, followed by a dessert of aspic molded into the shape of a fish. Sound absolutely revolting. Well, back in the 1920s, this was considered the height of culinary sophistication. Today we're diving deep into the bizarre world of foods our grandparents not only ate but actually swore by during the Roaring Twenties. The 1920s was a decade of dramatic change in America. The country was emerging from World War I, Prohibition was in full swing, and modern conveniences were just beginning to transform how people lived and ate. Without the luxury of our modern refrigeration systems, families relied on creative preservation methods and made do with whatever ingredients were available and affordable. What emerged was a fascinating culinary landscape that would seem absolutely foreign to us today. Let's start with one of the most popular appetizers of the era. Now, if you've never heard of aspic, consider yourself lucky. This was essentially any food suspended in gelatin, creating a wobbly, translucent mass that somehow passed for elegant dining. Families would spend hours preparing elaborate aspic molds filled with everything from vegetables to seafood to chunks of meat. The most popular varieties included tomato aspic, which looked like a red, jiggly brick, and salmon aspic, which resembled something you might find washed up on a beach. The obsession with gelatin extended far beyond savory dishes. Sweet gelatin salads were the crown jewel of any respectable dinner party. These weren't your simple jello creations either. We're talking about complex layered productions that combined fruit, nuts, vegetables, and sometimes even mayonnaise into one gelatinous masterpiece. Popular combinations included lime gelatin with cottage cheese and pineapple, or orange gelatin mixed with grated carrots and celery. The more elaborate the combination, the more sophisticated the hostess was considered to be. But perhaps nothing the bizarre food trends of the 1920s, quite like the era's obsession with organ meats. While today most Americans would run screaming from a plate of kidneys or liver, these were considered delicacies back then. Kidneys were often served for breakfast, pan-fried with onions and served alongside eggs. Liver and onions was a weekly staple in most households, and sweetbreads, which are actually the thymus glands of young animals, were served at fancy dinner parties. The real champion of organ meat consumption, however, was something called head. Despite its name, this contained no cheese whatsoever. Instead, it was made by boiling a pig's head until all the meat fell off the bones, then mixing that meat with the natural gelatin from the cooking process to create a loaf-like substance. Families would slice this up and serve it cold as a lunch meat. The fact that it was called cheese somehow made it more palatable to diners who might otherwise have been squeamish about eating pig's head. Moving beyond the realm of organ meats, the 1920s also saw some truly creative approaches to vegetables. One of the most popular dishes was something called perfection salad, which despite its name was neither perfect nor really a salad in the modern sense. This creation combined finely chopped cabbage, celery, and sweet peppers suspended in lemon-flavored gelatin. It was served as a side dish and was considered the height of nutritious eating. Another vegetable preparation that seems absolutely bizarre today was the practice of serving vegetables in white sauce for nearly every meal. This wasn't a delicate cream sauce like we might imagine, but rather a thick, flour-based concoction that completely masked the flavor and texture of whatever vegetable was unfortunate enough to be drowning beneath it. Cauliflower in white sauce, green beans in white sauce, carrots in white sauce. The bread and baked goods of the 1920s were equally peculiar by today's standards. Boston brown bread was a dense, dark loaf made with cornmeal, rye, flour, and molasses, then steamed in a can rather than baked in an oven. The result was a heavy, slightly sweet bread with an unusual texture that was often served with baked beans. Even stranger was something called graham gems, which were small, dense rolls made with graham flour and served with butter and honey. But perhaps the most mystifying aspect of 1920s cuisine was the era's approach to beverage. With alcohol prohibited, creative homemakers turned to all sorts of unusual drink combinations. Celery tonic was exactly what it sounds like. A fizzy drink flavored with celery extract that was supposed to have medicinal properties. Sarsaparilla made from the root of the sarsaparilla plant was another popular choice, as was something called phosphate, which was essentially flavored soda water served at drugstore soda fountains. The temperance movement also gave rise to some truly bizarre grape juice punch was served at elegant parties, often garnished with whole grapes frozen in ice cubes. Even more unusual was something called shrub, which was a drinking vinegar made by combining fruit juice with vinegar and sugar. The result was a tart, acidic beverage that was supposed to be refreshing, but probably tasted more like salad dressing. Breakfast in the 1920s deserves special mention for its sheer strangeness. While we might start our day with cereal or toast, families in the 20s often began with dishes that would make modern diners lose their appetite. Creamed, chipped beef on toast, affectionately known as something we can't say on this family-friendly channel, was a popular morning meal. This consisted of dried, salted beef rehydrated in a white sauce and served over toast. Even more unusual were the various preparations of eggs that went far beyond simple scrambling or frying. Deviled eggs weren't just a party appetizer. They were often served as a main course for breakfast or lunch. Egg croquettes, made by hard-boiling eggs, mashing them with seasonings, forming them into balls, breading them, and deep-frying them, were considered a substantial meal. The decades' approach to meat preservation and preparation also produced some truly memorable dishes. Without reliable refrigeration, families had to get creative with keeping meat fresh. This led to the popularity of dishes like corned beef hash, which used preserved meat mixed with potatoes and onions. Salt pork was another staple, used to flavor everything from beans to vegetables. But perhaps the most notorious preserved meat of the era was something called pressed chicken. This involves cooking a whole chicken until the meat fell off the bones, then pressing it into a loaf pan with its own natural gelatin and seasonings. The result was sliced and served cold, creating what essentially amounted to chicken lunch meat made at home. The 1920s also saw the rise of some truly creative casserole dishes that combined ingredients in ways that seem almost random today. Tuna and noodle casserole might sound familiar, but the 1920s version often included ingredients like crushed potato chips on top and canned peas throughout. Even stranger was something called salmon loaf, which combined canned salmon with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then baked it into a loaf shape and served it with white sauce. Desserts in the 1920s were equally bizarre, though perhaps more palatable to modern tastes than some of the savory dishes. Prune whip was a popular dessert made by beaten stewed prunes, with egg whites and sugar until fluffy. The result was a light, airy dessert that was supposed to be both delicious and nutritious. Another popular dessert was something called floating island, which consisted of soft meringue floating in a sea of custard. While this might sound appealing, the preparation often involved some questionable food safety practices by today's standards, with raw eggs and dairy products left at room temperature for extended periods. The influence of immigrant communities on 1920s cuisine also created some interesting fusion dishes that would seem strange today. Italian-American families created dishes like spaghetti and meatballs, which wasn't actually traditional in Italy but became hugely popular in America. German-American communities contributed dishes like sauerkraut and sausage combinations that were adapted to American tastes and available ingredients. One of the most fascinating aspects of 1920s food culture was the role of women's magazines in promoting these unusual dishes. Publications like Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal featured elaborate recipes that promised to make housewives the envy of their neighborhoods. These magazines promoted the idea that more complex and unusual dishes were indicators of sophistication and good homemaking skills. The economic realities of the 1920s also played a huge role in shaping food choices. While the decade is often remembered as a time of prosperity, many families still needed to stretch their food budgets. This led to creative uses of inexpensive ingredients like gelatin, which could make a small amount of more expensive ingredients like meat or fruit go much further. The lack of modern kitchen appliances also influenced how food was prepared and served. Without electric mixers, blenders, or food processors, many dishes required extensive hand preparation. This often resulted in textures and preparations that we would find unusual today, simply because they were the result of the tools available at the time. Perhaps most importantly, the 1920s represented a transitional period in American food culture. Families were moving away from purely traditional, regional cooking toward a more standardized, national cuisine influenced by mass-produced ingredients and national advertising campaigns. This created some truly unique combinations as traditional recipes were adapted to incorporate new processed foods. The health and nutrition understanding of the 1920s also contributed to some bizarre food choices. Many people believed that gelatin was incredibly nutritious and that white sauce added important nutrients to vegetables. The food pyramid as we know it didn't exist, and much of what people believed about nutrition would be considered completely wrong today. Looking back at these strange culinary trends, It's easy to laugh at our grandparents' food choices, but it's important to remember that they were working with the knowledge, ingredients, and technology available to them at the time. In many ways, they were incredibly resourceful, creating elaborate and satisfying meals from limited ingredients and without modern conveniences. The 1920s food culture also reflects the social aspirations of the era. Families wanted to appear sophisticated and modern, and food was one way to demonstrate status and refinement. The more elaborate and unusual the dish, the more it showed that the family had both the time and resources to create something special. As we wrap up our journey through the bizarre foods of the 1920s, it's worth considering what future generations might think of our current food trends. Will they laugh at our obsession with kale smoothies and avocado toast? Will they find our molecular gastronomy and fusion cuisine as strange as we find aspic and head? The foods our grandparents swore by in the 1920s tell a fascinating story about American culture, economics, and values during a pivotal decade in our nation's history. While we might not want to return to a diet of organ meats and gelatin salads, understanding these culinary traditions helps us appreciate how far we've come and perhaps gain some perspective on our own food choices. So the next time you sit down to a simple meal of fresh ingredients prepared with modern techniques, take a moment to appreciate that you're not facing a plate of pig's head cheese or a wobbling tower of tomato aspic. Our grandparents may have sworn by these bizarre foods, but thankfully, some traditions are better left in the past where they belong.